So with that, I want to turn it over to Charlie. Thank you very much for coming. He's one of our favorites in the Paul Miller rotation. So Charlie, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I know the program's like 30 years old. I think I've been doing these on and off for 20, 25 years, but it really is a terrific program. You guys are all very fortunate to be able to take advantage of this. Normally the election, the 2018 or 2020 election was exactly 90 days ago. And we've got 645 days until the next one. So normally we would be in, a little bit of a lull, not that much to talk about, but that's certainly not the case right now. And that these really are odd times. And I am going to talk for, a little bit about the partisanship that's out there, because it really does transcend into everything that we're seeing going on, and including, the current sort of stalemate over the coronavirus relief. I mean, I confess to being a little bit of a loss of what the White House is really thinking right now, because I've never heard of an initial offer being the final offer at the same time. And, when you consider that the last package went through just 42 days ago, and there's a little bit of a feeling that the 1.9 number is like the product of an immaculate conception and shouldn't be touched in any way. When, I think that Republicans have, certainly there's some Republicans that would be against doing anything, but I think you do have particularly this group of 10 Republican senators that are supposed to meet with the president today sometime. They have some concerns that are not necessarily crazy. I mean, the idea of a family making as much as $300,000 a year getting a stimulus check, really? Usually there's a negotiation going on, and I think that's what's going to end up happening. But the question is, how much sort of political altitude will the president lose before he gets to the place where I think a lot of us kind of expect him to end up doing with something, less than 1.9 billion, but still, or a trillion, but it was still a very, very, very big number. But let's talk about the partisanship for a second. This election that we just had was pretty amazing. That we had exactly 2/3 of the voting eligible population turned out. That was the highest of any presidential election since 1900. And it came on the heels of a midterm election that was the highest midterm election since 1914. And when you consider that we'd been going through a period of fairly average, run-of-the-mill turnout levels, and suddenly, just phenomenally high midterm turnout followed by a phenomenally high presidential turnout. And I think there's a simple explanation for it, that unlike a lot of the time over the last 20, 30 years, people really thought it was important, that it mattered who wins. Pew Research has done some surveys just before the last 5, 6, 7 presidential elections, and they asked people, do you think it really matters who wins the presidential election, or do you think things will be pretty much the same regardless of who is elected? And just to give you a frame of reference, back in 2000, 50% of voters said that it really matters who wins, and 44% said it'd be pretty much the same. So a 6-point difference. In 2004, it was 67 really matters, 29 pretty much the same. So a 38-point difference. And 31-point difference in 2008, 29 points in 2012. Then in 2016, the Trump-Clinton election, there was a 52-point gap. 74% said it really mattered. 22% said not really. This time it was 83-16. And I think part of what drives that is that, one of the other questions that Pew asked was, they asked the Trump voters, if Biden wins, would you be very concerned about the country's direction and that Biden's election would lead to lasting harm to the US? Or do you think you would be very concerned if Biden won, but it would not lead to lasting harm? And they did that for each group. And among the Trump voters, 89% said that Biden winning would lead lasting harm. Among the Biden voters, 90% said that it would lead to lasting harm. And when I looked at the footage of those people, and some of you were probably up there on January 6th, and you kind of look at these people and you know that some of these people were veterans that had risked their lives for our country. And, to me, it looked like the inmates were taking over the asylum. But the thing about it is these people clearly thought the country was in danger. And you just kind of wonder, wow, what in the hell would lead people to behave that way? And obviously they think there's some danger there. And why would they think that? How would they reach that conclusion that this kind of thing was, warranted, necessary, important, acceptable? And it does lead to a very interesting conversation about, where are people getting their news, where they're getting their information coverage. And, the old line about everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own set of facts. Well, gosh, we've got a lot of these people in this country, and both right and left, that, boy, they've created their own set of facts that looks to me like a fantasy world, but, whatever. Anyway, but, partisanship has been with us since as long as we've had parties, but it's, this is not normal where we've been. And to give you an idea, first of all, the country is just so narrowly divided, not evenly divided, but not far off of evenly divided. Biden's margin over Trump was just 4 points, 51.1 to 47.1. But, if you just say the two-party vote, just Democrats, Republicans, you throw out the independent, it was 52-48. If you look at the national House vote, it was 51-49. You go back 4 years, that was, 2.9% margin or 2.1% margin, but the two-party vote was 51-49. The national party vote in 2016 for the House was 50-50. Wow, this country is very, very, very narrowly divided. And the thing is that what we're seeing happen, if you look at the Gallup numbers for 2020, and 30% identified themselves as Democrats, 30%, 29% identified themselves as Republicans, and 38 as independents. And so people tend to think there's this big block of independents and they're sort of the deciders. But the fact is that most of these independents aren't really that independent at all, because the vast majority of independents aren't really very independent. Because if you ask them, well, would you say you lean to the Democratic side or you lean to the Republican side? Vast majority of them lean one way or the other. And of the independents who say they lean Democrat, 80% of them will vote down the line for Democrats. And the same thing for the independents who lean Republican. 80% of them will vote. So that there's some people that call themselves independents, but functionally speaking, they really are partisans, or almost as partisan as real partisans. So that the slice of people that are in the middle is really only, depending upon the pollster, between 8 and 12 percentage points. And you never know, how many of those people are really going to vote at all. But when you think of sort of the level that we see very, very few defections that are out there, in the two major, we call them exit polls, but they're really not exit polls anymore, but national polls taken just before the election. And one is the Edison that was for ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and the other is the VoteCast for AP, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, PBS, and NPR. In the Edison exit poll, Biden beat Trump among Democrats by an 88-point margin, 94-6. In the VoteCast, Biden beat Trump among Democrats by a 91-point margin. Then you look over the other side, the Edison, Trump beat Biden by an 88-point margin among Republicans, 94-6. and the vote cast was 83-point margin, 91 to 8. So if you were saying, they were playing tennis, you'd say each side held their serve very, very, very closely. And it was not much different from 4 years ago when it was like 96-3 and 93-6. So very, very, very few defections on each side. And the other thing is very, very little ticket splitting. When you think about the US Senate, it wasn't that long ago that, a fair amount of people would vote for a presidential candidate of one party and a Senate candidate of the other. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was beating President Carter by a 10-point margin, Republicans had a net gain of 12 US Senate seats. But even then, there were a dozen Senate races that voted for Reagan and for a Democrat for the US Senate. Well, if you think about 2016, that was the first election since we started the direct election of US senators that not one single, or that every single US Senate race went exactly the same way that state had gone in the presidential, every single one. In this election, it was all but one, where Susan Collins was the only person to win a US Senate race last year in a state that the other side carried in the presidential. We've just never seen anything like that before. I mean, the trend has been growing this general direction, but not to this level whatsoever, to the point where now, from 1955 to 1980, you had on average 10 to 15 states would have split delegations, Democrat, Republican. Right now, actually, it was actually in the 20, 15, 20, 25. Now there are only 6 states in the country have a split U.S. Senate delegation with one member from a Democrat, one from the Republican. If you look back on the House, I mean, for example, from 1956 through 1996, you had anywhere from 100 to 192 House districts that would vote one way for presidential and the other way for the House of Representatives. In 2012, it was 26. In 2016, it was 35. Last year, 16. Only 16 districts in the entire country. 7 where you had Democrats win in Trump districts, and 9 where you had Republicans win in Biden districts. We never saw anything quite like that before. And that while a lot of people tend to want to blame the politicians for the partisanship, I think a lot of these folks ought to probably look in the mirror. I mean, there's a public policy institute that does some great polling, the Public Religion Research Institute. And they had a survey in 2019 that 80% of Democrats believe that the Republican Party has been taken over by racists, 80%. And 82% of Republicans believe the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists. And, Pew Research did a survey, 2019, that 55% of Republicans said Democrats were more immoral than other Americans. And 47% of Democrats said the same thing about Republicans, that it didn't used to be this way where you just you had this negative partisanship of just sort of hating the other side more than you may even like your own side. But what this has meant is that we now have a time where you've got really big blocks of voters that, let's say you're a Republican, that no matter how horrible your party's candidate might be, you're going to vote for them for no matter what. And the same thing over on the Democratic side, where people are just voting straight down the line and candidate quality means nothing at all. This is just so different. But because the two parties are so evenly divided, it makes things much more volatile than it used to be. I mean, we're at a point, first time in American history, where we've had 4 consecutive presidents that each one of them have had the House and their party has lost control of both the House and the Senate, both of them. That, you had 1994 with Bill Clinton. Democrats lost the House and the Senate. In 2006, Republicans lost both the House and the Senate under George W. Bush. Under Obama, Democrats lost the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. Under Trump, Republicans lost the House in 2018 and the Senate in 2020. And what this does is it sort of creates this ping pong policy development of things going these wild gyrations from one side to the other. And that real quickly, part of this has been going on for 50, 60 years, and where you'd call it ideological sorting, where, in the old days, you used to have a lot of conservative, moderate Democrats, particularly from the South. You had a lot of liberal, moderate Republicans, particularly from the Northeast and the West Coast. And over time, the conservative, moderate Democrats, literally, they died, they lost re-election, they lost their primaries, or they retired. And the same thing with these liberal, moderate Republicans. And they were all sort of replaced by people, the conservative Democratic seats went Republican, and the liberal, moderate Republican seats went Democratic, so that the parties, there used to be an overlap between the two parties. And now there's essentially no overlap at all. I mean, there's not a single Democrat in the Senate or in the House or Senate that's really more conservative than a single Republican, or vice versa. And that didn't used to be the case at all. I mean, when I was in college and working up on the Hill in the 70s, I was working for a fairly conservative Democratic senator, and across the hall was Senator Ed Brooke, who was a very liberal Republican African-American senator from Massachusetts. And you could see that happening. But now, boy, there's just no overlap at all. And then you impose in sort of the different media structure we have today, and you just sort of see these ideological silos among voters and within the parties that are out there. And what that means is that you have parties, and we're supposed to talk about redistricting, that the parties are just a lot more audacious than they used to be about how far they would go to basically screw the other side in redistricting. It's not that they would ever do the other side any favors, but they never went to these lengths. But in the 80s, 90s, we just started seeing this more and more and more. And when you sort of had a philosophical shift on redistricting with Republicans starting in the 80s, where up until that point, a lot of Republicans in Congress or in legislatures around the country, took a rather dim view of creation of minority districts. And we won't get into their motives. But then you started seeing this realization among a lot of Republican strategists and elected officials in the 80s and 90s that to the extent that they would create minority districts and pack as many normally Democratic voting minorities into specific districts, that it would, and this is a terrible phrase, but bleach out the adjacent districts, make them whiter, and make them more likely to go Republican. And so you started seeing these odd coalitions develop during the redistricting process of, minorities. Obviously, they wanted to create more minority seats, and Republicans realized, hey, this is in our best interest too. And you had Democrats who typically are friendlier with minority voters, but say, wait a minute, this is kind of screwing. So you started seeing things getting a lot more complicated during those 80s and 90s process. Redistricting process. But, we are seeing some realignment taking place. Not less so with minority voters. I mean, you'll see some trends back and forth of some subgroups of minority voters shifting around a little bit. And you saw, for example, Trump do a little bit better among certain minority groups this time than last. Not that much more, but a little bit. But the biggest differences are these cleavages we're seeing among white voters of a gender gap that's getting wider and wider and wider, education gap, geography, small town, rural, getting far more conservative Republican, suburban voters getting moving a lot less away from Republicans and towards Democrats. All these sort of lots and lots of changes from where things were back 40, 50, 60 years ago. And it's just completely changed the nature of our politics, the direction of it. It's made things a lot more vitriolic, but we're frankly seeing this not just on the candidate level and the elected official level, but on the voter, just simply the voter level as well. And that, just sort of the old thing about, you can agree to disagree, or, we may, but not challenge their motives. Man, we're just not seeing that at all. And it's just, for somebody that's watched this process for a long time, it's really, really, really alarming to me. And that, for the longest time, I thought, well, maybe some horrible crisis would come along that would sort of bring people back together and sort of get past some of this partisanship. But, 9/11, which was the event that I would have guessed might have been it, we saw this brief kind of kumbaya moment right after 9/11, but then the fight breaks out. Should we invade Iraq? Yes or no? And things split out even more. And then now we've got the coronavirus, and one would have thought that, a pandemic might bring the country together, but instead it's just highlighting more differences between ideological differences, difference of values between the two sides, so that, I don't want to sound like a hand wringer type, but let me tell you, this is getting really, really, really pretty serious. And I think that, people ought to be sort of thinking, okay, what is the source of this? Where is this coming from? And how are people in various, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or journalists or whatever, what is happening that is feeding this, that is making this much worse, and having these kinds of policy consequences, that it really is quite significant. I think I've used up my front end. So let's just take this conversation wherever you guys want to go.
Okay, so the way we're running here, if you guys have questions, I guess just raise your hand, or either raise your hand and, okay, we'll go to Nathaniel, then we'll go to Riley. And then we'll go
let
to
me
Caroline.
let me know where you're from and where you're working too, just so I have an idea.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm from New York City, and I work for Newsy and EW Scripts. My question for you is just when you talk about that, the overlap that used to exist, which apparently doesn't exist any longer. Are we still seeing that, though, with some governorships? I mean, I'm thinking specifically about the governor of Maryland, the governor of Vermont, the governor of Massachusetts. Why is it that those states are able to maintain, I guess, nonpartisan-ish type governors who can toe that party line?
That's a great question. The thing is, federal races, that is Senate, House, presidential, they just are much more left, right. I mean, just more, they are driven more by national politics and by perceptions of the national parties. And governors and legislative have always been a little bit less. But the other thing is, and notice the ones you're talking about where Massachusetts, I'm thinking particularly Massachusetts and Maryland. Maryland's where I live now. That these are very, very Democratic states. There's states where Democrats own the legislatures, lock, stock, and barrel, and where there is some history of states that are overwhelmingly one side, liking the idea of electing a governor from the opposite side, and it's their own sort of odd way of separation of powers, you may think, and I know that there are a lot of people in Maryland that think this, and a lot of people in Massachusetts that think this, that the legislators are, a bunch of crooks and scoundrels or whatever. And they like the idea of having a governor from the opposite party just to keep them honest, or to kind of balance things out. And you'll notice, going the other direction, Steve Bullock was the Democratic governor of Montana. And had he run for re-election and Steve Daines, the Republican senator, were running against Bullock, I think there would have been an excellent chance that Bullock would have won that race. But instead, he was a Democratic governor running for a federal office for the U.S. Senate, and simply couldn't make it happen. And a lot of Democrats thought that, hey, we have a chance of taking the Kansas Senate race because we just elected a Democrat governor of Kansas 2 years ago. Well, but that was governor, not U.S. Senate. And so there, you don't see an enormous amount of it, but you do see it some. And there does seem to be more of a tradition of New England Northeast being more likely to go where they're Democratic states, but more likely to flip over and go with a Democratic governor, or excuse me, a Republican governor. You're more likely to see it there. But I think it is sort of this odd separation of powers thing that happens, that can happen. But state races just aren't nearly, and I don't want to suggest that they're not partisan, because state legislative races tend to go, roughly speaking, the same general direction as a presidential race, but just not nearly to that degree. They're just not as left-right as federal races are.
Okay.
So, and actually, let me add one on that. Larry Hogan, take Maryland for example. Larry Hogan is willing to do things that most Republican members of Congress or Republican congressional would not be willing to do. I mean, he sort of tries to split the difference between the Republican Party and Democratic voters in the state. And I'd say the same thing for Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, that, and Massachusetts just has a long history of, Bill Welds and of elected Mitt Romney's of electing governors that are Republicans, because the Democrats absolutely own the legislatures. So having elected officials that maybe have a little more ideological dexterity and willing to make compromises, and that's how they could win from their party, and despite the fact that they're in a, what should be a hostile state.
Okay, so just a heads up on time and questions. So the list of those who are coming next, we have Riley, Caroline Simon, Nicholas, Arjun, Orion, Madison, Caroline Kelly, and Joey.
I will try to type my answers.
Yeah, so kind of think in terms of like 90-second to 2-minute max answers. Yeah. And we got a lot of questions, which is great, but that means try to limit it to one concise question, and we'll go to Riley next.
So thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I've been thinking, as you were talking about sort of the role of media silos, and you were talking about how so many people are really like trapped in these sort of information spaces. They're not exposed to anybody with a different ideological viewpoint. And it's really like alarming to me how much people really don't trust those of us that are still in the mainstream media. I wondered if there were any sort of really obvious solutions to you that we might be missing about what we can do in, mainstream news to help people trust us again.
Yeah. First of all, let me emphasize that these views are mine and mine only, and not those of the National Press Foundation or its management. I think, increasingly people see anything that I don't agree with or anything that I don't want to hear by definition is biased, right? It's screwy. But journalism has changed. And I'm a middle of the roader and I'm an independent, and I'm not saying, liberal bias. That's not where I'm going here. But back in the old days, late 60s, early 70s, when I was taking high school journalism, there were rules. Rules in terms of news coverage. Who, what, when, where. And nothing that could remotely involve a value judgment could go in a news story. Opinion, be my guest. News, not. And that I think over time, journalists it was a combination of getting a little bit into explanatory journalism. It was a little bit of news reporters going on cable television and starting to give opinions and things. But that wall started eroding. And I promise you that when I took journalism, if you said that something an elected official said was false, untrue, a lie, even if it was, you'd get flunked. You can't do that. Now, what you could do is point to an authoritative source. You say, Congressman X said this. And then you point to 1, 2, 3, 4 authoritative sources that basically the sources say this isn't true. But it never came out of the reporter's voice. They didn't say it was untrue. And you basically show them it was untrue and hope that your reader, viewer, listener is intelligent enough to figure out that that guy just lied to you. But you never said it. And I personally think that there are a lot of journalists that are so appalled by things that various politicians, but particularly President Trump, would say, that they would say absolutely false. And hey, I may not even disagree with them. Maybe it was totally true, but it's totally false. But you can't say that, for Christ's sake. You can't say that. And that people start seeing that as journalists becoming combatants. They're taking sides. And I think that you've seen I don't know how you get, I've been thinking, one of these days, President Trump's going to be gone. And the question is, can you get the genie back in the bottle? Can you get journalists back to a point where they're not saying things that may be true, but they still come across, they're still subjective assessments of this isn't true? And I think that our profession has done some, I personally think, irreparable damage to it. And the manifestation of it is when you've got people, when I was supposed to contract, okay. Old days, ABC, CBS, NBC, and their local affiliates, and they had generally radio networks too, AP, UPI, your local newspaper, everybody got their news from the same place. Everybody, the same set of facts, basically. And then you could go off and be a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or conservative, whatever the hell you want to be. But everybody started off with the same set of facts. But now with people, trusted news source is someone who's going to tell me what I already think and confirm what I already believe. So that now, if you're hearing, hey, this coronavirus, it's kind of serious, it will fucking kill you, you got to wear a mask. And if you're not watching, you're not listening, you're not reading a news outlet that's sort of telling you that, then it affects your behavior. And I think that you've got people that are constructing their own sets of facts because they're no longer participating in terms of getting Main Street coverage. And if you look at the trust numbers in the surveys, yes, it's a lot more conservative Republicans disagree, have tuned out national, but you actually find it a fair amount among Democrats and a fair amount among independents. And I think it's the sort of the cherished position of being seen as a neutral person, a neutral, reporter, rather than making assessments that may absolutely be true, but people don't see that as you being a fair, nonpartisan, unbiased reporter. They see it as opinion, and the lines are just now hopelessly blurred. As I said, that's not a commonly held view in the profession, but.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Caroline Simon.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm from outside Philadelphia, and I'm with CQ Roll Call.
What county?
Montgomery.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So at CQ, we also, advertise ourselves as being nonpartisan, and that's something I've been struggling a little bit with, especially over the last couple of months, given that this whole situation with overturning the election results is not just a policy difference, but it seems like certain members of one party don't support kind of the tenets of democracy. I'm curious about how to navigate nonpartisan coverage in a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I trust me, I'm as appalled as you are. I guess I get back to, how did we get there? How did we get to a point where, that woman that was shot, here was somebody who had served our country in the military, and she had come to some warped point of view that led her to behaving in that way. And it's like, how did we get here? And so, you've actually got me stumped, because I don't know how you fix something. Sometimes you break something and it's just so badly broken that you can try to glue it, piece it back together. But I really wonder, I don't know how we get this trust back, but I personally, in a perfect world, people would read, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. They'd be watching PBS NewsHour every evening. They'd be reading The Economist cover to cover every Saturday. That's the perfect world. Crap. I would just settle for, take a pick, ABC, CBS, just watch one of them for half an hour a night. I don't care which one, just one of them, for God's sake, where you're getting something that is not, gonna be sort of channeling one point, and where people will sort of generally accept what it is. Because the thing is, I think the people that go into journalism, I think people that by nature go into journalism tend to be slightly more liberal than people that, say, go into the military or, whatever. But, people that are violinists are probably more likely to be liberal than than really conservative or something. But the thing is, there was a little bit of tilt in the scales 30, 40, 50 years ago, but it was pretty minor, pretty benign. But the perception of that got so bad that people started tuning out, and now they're just not there at all. So no, you raise a good question of how do you, based on where we are today, how do you fix it? And I don't have a really good solution, but I think one solution would be to try to go back to what the rules used to be and show people when someone is lying through their teeth, but you just don't say it. And try, hopefully you've got some, authoritative sources that people would be likely to believe that, no, this guy, this, congressman, congresswoman just lied to you. Show them that they lied, but just don't say so. But you raise a great question. How do you fix it? It's one thing to say it's broken. It is. But how do you fix it? That's a really, really good question.
So it's 9:45. We were supposed to end right now. I've just contacted the next speaker, and we're pushing him and the next speaker back 5 minutes so we can at least get a couple more questions in. But this has really got to be lightning round. Let's try to get to Nicholas, Arjun, and Orion. So try to get at least 3 questions in and tight answers, and we'll go to 9:50. And for those of you who won't get your questions in, I apologize. So Nicholas.
Hi there. Thanks for doing this, Charlie. I'm sorry, but my question might not be so much of a short answer. But I was wondering, about the Cook Political Report's forecasting. A lot of us, rely on the House and Senate ratings to help, kind of guide how we look at, things going into an election year. And things did not quite go the way that a lot of those ratings went this past November. So, what are you guys going to do differently heading into the 2022 elections?
Well, I would say it's more the perception. How many? Let's do presidential first. how many states that we had rated as lean, likely, or solid Democrat that went to Trump? 0. How many states that we had as lean, likely, solid Trump go Democrat? 0. Same thing in the US Senate. In 2016, we were wrong on 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That's it. I mean, we had 45 states rated right, 2 toss-ups in the presidential, Florida, North Carolina, okay, and those 3 wrong. Now, in the House, in the Senate and presidential race this time, what you had was the toss-ups broke overwhelmingly one way, where, for example, of the states that we had in the presidential, of the states that we had rated as toss-ups, Trump won every single one of them except Georgia. Every one of them. And in the Senate races, basically all but Georgia. I mean, the thing is that what happens is it was the toss-ups broke so that you really didn't have genuine upsets. Now, in the House of Representatives, that's where you really, really, really did have upsets. I mean, where you had districts that were rated as, lean or likely, generally lean Democrat that went Republican. Now, why did that happen? Now, that's a good question, because we don't usually have that many. We've had more this time than we'd ever had before. I personally think that there was a wave out there a month before the election, 6-8 weeks ago. And I can tell you, Republican consultants, Republican strategists, Republican officials, Republican pollsters, they sure as hell thought it was too. But I think what happened was you had voters saying, okay, we're going to throw out Trump, we're going to elect Biden, but I think they kind of got squeamish. All this sort of socialism, defund the police, pack the Supreme Court. I think they got skittish about, okay, look, we're going to give Biden the keys to the car, but I don't think I want to give him a full tank of gas and a credit card too. And where they just sort of backed off, but it wasn't being wrong. It was toss-ups breaking overwhelmingly one direction. So these weren't wrong ratings for the most part, other than, there were some in the House, but the Senate and the presidential, it's a matter of perception. And then a lot of that goes back, 2016, it was people seeing national polls that said Hillary Clinton was ahead. And guess what? What do national polls do? They needed the national popular vote. Guess what? She did win. But the Electoral College is different, and state by state. And you did have 3 states that had some really screwy polling back in 2016. But I think the final thing is that, I think we tend to focus on so-and-so being 3 points ahead or 10 points ahead, when we ought to look at what's the top number and realize that undecided voters are, guess what? They're undecided. And that if undecideds break overwhelmingly one direction, that's going to render a different result than what you may have thought about before. And that we don't think or focus on undecideds as much as we did. But there were a lot fewer upsets than I think a lot of people think, because they think that, to us, I mean, when we put a race as toss up, it means we're not sure. We're not sure at all which way it's going to go. And that's what happened. They basically all broke one way.